Chapter 11. Okay, I'll go get both and bring both boxes back, Elijah called back to her, before jogging across the wide empty field where all their cars were parked. Today, she and a portion of the Watiz crew were out at the solar farm, measuring and setting up additional panels. Unlike the first time she came out, Sanaa was prepared for the muddy terrain, wearing a pair of work boots she bought from the sporting goods store along with a pair of jeans and a plain black sweater and her blue raincoat. She felt ready for anything nature threw her way. Well, almost anything, she thought as she felt the heat creep up the back of her neck and into her ears. That morning Zac had dropped her off at the site against all her protests. While she had tried to argue that her little SUV could indeed handle the thick mud, he had simply given her that sharp, predatory smile before hauling her against him and planting a devastating kiss to her lips, making her forget all about her protests as she responded to his kiss. Feeling more like a child than a grown woman as he dropped her off, she barely resisted crossing her arms in a show of petulance as the other Watiz men watched with large smiles as Zac handed her her bag and equipment before pulling her in for yet another fierce kiss. Although that kiss had been different, possessive and claiming, he worked his mouth masterfully over hers, demanding her to respond and forcing her brain to forget their audience as he held both of her elbows at her side, locking her arms in place. Stunned and out of breath, she watched the evil man hop back into his truck with a satisfied look and a wink, promising to see her later tonight. Thankfully, when she had turned around, all the Watiz men had been conveniently turned away and working on bringing out the panels from their trucks. Just thinking of it made her blush return along with memories from last night. Turning her face up to the dreary gray sky, Sanaa inhaled at the cold wind buffeting against her face. She still couldn't believe half the things she said last night. She had spoken of being pregnant and having his children, for goodness sakes. Placing a hand over her throat, she could feel the heat from her skin against her hand and knew her face no doubt looked flushed. Yet it hadn't just been her last night who responded to those erotic words. Zac's jeweled eyes had glowed brightly in the darkness as he lifted and dropped her body against his arousal. She had seen the muscles in his strong neck and wide shoulder tense when she described herself swollen with child. She had seen his unmistakable need for those words to come true. Sanaa bit her lip at the thought. Even now, her breasts felt suddenly heavy, and her sex warmed at the memory. Knowing that Zac wanted her in a future with her made her want to cry with joy. Opening her eyes with a start, Sanaa quickly looked around. Good Lord, when had she closed her eyes? Thankfully it seemed no one was watching her. Pushing back more strands of her windswept hair that seemed determined to escape her ponytail, Sanaa focused her mind back on the present and off of Zac. There would be plenty of time to concern herself with Zac when he got back tonight. Walking around the measuring tape she had laid out on the ground, her boots sank with an audible squish on the muddy terrain as she looked at her tablet, and she brushed a few loose strands of hair back from around her face again. Following the notification for her email, Sanaa quickly read the short message and sighed in relief. The man from Galding she had been considering, Jax Baronic, accepted the job and wrote that he would come out tomorrow to help install and properly integrate the remainder of the panels. Well, that made everything so much easier. Looking up to where Elijah ran off to, she wondered if she called out would he hear her. She could see him in the distance standing next to his father's truck reaching over the side for the heavy boxes. If the new engineer was coming out tomorrow, there would really be no point for her to try to install the control panel now. It would make much more sense to wait to have it all done by the same guy who would have all three cities running along the same installation. Making her decision, Sanaa began to walk over to the vehicles but stopped at the rustling sound to her right. Having been cut out of the existing forest, the clearing they were working in was surrounded by a wall of thick trees. Stepping out of those trees was a face she thought she would never see again, Earl Salmons, with the same look of contempt he had always worn for anyone of color in Tarky. Earl Salmons stopped and stood a few yards from her. The years had not been kind to him, she noted. His rotund gut that once sat high on his large frame now drooped low past his belt and settled before him like a big soft sack. And though he was no longer the city's sheriff, a position since filled by Una Watiz, he wore a pair of dark jeans and a matching denim long-sleeve shirt, an outfit eerily reminiscent of the uniform he once wore. So you came back, did ya? Didn't think you'd have the nerve after you got those boys killed. He sneered at her with narrowed eyes as if he was examining a bug underneath his foot. A hollow feeling spread from Sanaa's chest and into her veins as unwelcome memories crept into her mind. What? She breathed, hoping she misheard him. Don't play dumb, Salmon shot back before letting out a thick mucus-filled cough. Taking a step forward, his face hardened as he got his breathing back in order and glared at her. You know what you did, he said, pointing an accusing finger at her. I know what you did, and I know what your monster boyfriend did. Do you know they never found those two boys' bodies? Just bits and pieces. Do you even care? She felt as if her whole world was turning white and empty around her as she stared wide-eyed at the man. I don't know what you're talking about, she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. She had to go. She needed to get away from him and away from the memories he was dredging up from the recesses of her mind, memories she had buried years ago. Taking an unsteady step backward, she mentally rejoiced at the small victory and pushed herself to step back further until she was turning on her heel with every intention of running to the vehicles through the mud, clutching her equipment to her chest. But the sudden painful grip on her arm stopped her and spun her forcefully back around. Much closer now, Salmon stared down at her, his jowly face reddening in his strange irrational anger. I don't think so, he hissed, shaking her with a bruising tug to her arm. You and your filth need to be dash. Salmon's let out a howl of pain just as she saw the familiar tanned hand enclose around the man's wrist. With surprising strength, Elijah snatched Salmon's hand from her arm before twisting it behind the man with a painful snap, with a powerful shove that propelled the much larger man away, causing him to stumble and fall on his ass. Elijah stood like a wall in front of her, wearing not a single trace of the sweet boy she had come to know. Hatred glittered from Elijah's dark golden eyes as he stared down at the former sheriff, who held his wrist limply with his other hand. You will never touch her again, Elijah declared, his words filled with lethal promise. Sanaa looked worriedly from the sheriff's face as it transformed from shock to reddening anger as he stared up at the boy. She could see the man's hurt pride mix and churn with his volatile anger as he struggled to stand with a wince in the sopping mud beneath him. Stepping closer to Elijah, Sanaa was prepared to pull the much taller boy back behind her. She would not let Salmons try to hurt him, she vowed. You piece of animal filth, Salmon sputtered as he got to one knee, pushing himself up with his good hand, covered in mud and some of his thinning hair clinging to his red and sweating face. The man looked at them both with rage distorting his features. Reaching behind his back, he pulled something from his belt and pointed it at Elijah. I know what you are, he yelled. Sanaa's grip on Elijah's shirt tightened as she recognized the silver gleam of a hunting knife. Desperately she pulled at the tall boy, willing him to step further back, but Elijah would not budge. He stared down at the man as if he was staring down at something small and insignificant, completely ignoring the weapon. Well, she wasn't going to ignore it. Grabbing Elijah's arm, she pulled more forcefully now, causing him to turn slightly towards her, but his eyes never left Salmon's. Elijah, please, she pleaded. Let's just go, we can call Una to dash. Take Sanaa to the truck. A voice from their right spoke, and both her and Salmons looked to see Adam standing next to them, his normally genial face set an unforgiving stone. Actually, they were suddenly surrounded by the Wati's crew. Elijah's father, Darius, stood at her left while three more men came to stand around the kneeling man, caging him in. Reaching for the portly man, Adam grabbed him by the collar and easily hoisted the man to his feet. You're fucked now, Darius growled at the man with a sharp, almost hungry smile. I cannot tell you how much shit you're going to be in when we tell Zac about this. Giving one look over his shoulder, Adam cast Elijah a warning look. To the truck now, he reminded him before turning back to Salmons. Though I shouldn't, I would advise you to leave town, Salmons. Now. Sanaa felt the hand wrap around hers and looked to see Elijah, whose face was much softer than it had been moments before, give her a soft smile. Come on, he urged gently, pulling her away. Shaking herself from her shocked and addled nerves, Sanaa dug her feet into the mud, halting them both. No, she would not be ushered away. She wanted to know what was going on and what. Her thoughts were interrupted with a little cry from her lips as Elijah bent down and wrapped his arms around her thighs. "I'm sorry," he said politely as he straightened up to his full height, lifting her high against him. To her horror and anger, she watched as not one member of the Wati's crew turned to look at her as Elijah began to walk away with her. "Elijah, put me down," she protested, trying to push at his firm shoulders. But the boy was very strong. Nothing she did gained her an inch. "And if you somehow get away before Zac gets here and survive, that is..." She could hear Darius's dark words and strained to hear the rest as Elijah carried her further and further away from the men. "Never come near our family again. That includes Sanaa," Adam added before the rest of his words became too far away for her to make out. Finally, across the field, Elijah sat her gingerly to her feet. Pushing away from him, she scowled at him, to which she immediately felt guilty for. No longer filled with glittering rage, Elijah turned his doleful gaze towards her, completely banishing any anger she had for the young man. "I'm sorry, we just wanted to get you away from that lunatic," he explained, his dark upturned eyebrows giving his eyes an even more sorrowful look. Sanaa shook her head, her mortification for being carted off by a boy her brother's age forgotten. "It's okay." Looking back toward the end of the field, she squinted and frowned as she strained to see the details. She watched as the pale figure of Sammons dashed into the woods as the Wati's men gathered close and watched. Adam pointed to the forest, and one of the men, Kevin, went in after him at a slower pace. With one last glance to the forest's edge, then men turned and started walking back their way. "Did he hurt you?" Elijah asked, bringing her attention back to him, and he pointed to where she had been holding her arm unknowingly. The area did pulse with a bit of lingering pain, and she was sure there was a bruise there, but Sanaa shook her head. "No, I'm fine." Approaching them, Adam stopped in front of her and placed his hands lightly on her shoulders and gave her a worried look. "Are you okay?" Sanaa opened her mouth but stopped. She wanted to reply in her usual "I'm fine," but she was anything but fine. She felt like she was shaking all over. And with every second that passed, it became worse and more visible. She felt cold and displaced as the man's words buffeted against the weakening defenses of her mind. Shaking her head, she answered honestly, "No." Alarm passed over Adam's dark honeygold eyes as he looked her over. "Did he hurt you?" Looking to Elijah, both man and teenager began speaking in their native language. Elijah pointed to her arm. Sanaa wanted to scowl at him for ratting her out as Adam immediately reached for her sleeve and began to peel back the fabric for a better look. Sanaa waited with held breath as Adam revealed her red arm. The collective of men around her made sounds of dismay and cursed under their breaths, and she could swear she heard an unmistakable growl from someone. "Sanaa, darling," Adam groaned and pulled her into a gentle hug that only made her want to cry. "I'm so sorry. Do you want me to take you to Dr. Huang?" Shaking her head, she pulled herself back reluctantly from his warm fatherly embrace and shouldered her shirt back into place properly as she shook her head and gave them all a forced smile. "No, I'm fine really. I think I'm going to go home early for today. The field engineer should be here tomorrow to get everything properly set up." Her words trailed off as she looked to the vehicles, desperate to escape and be alone with the thoughts that crept at the edges of her mind like an encroaching storm. "Okay." Adam paused, and she could see that he wanted to argue but stopped himself. "I will take you home. And while I don't think Sammons is dumb enough to try to go to your house, not with 5 Watises living in your neighborhood, and Zac being your neighbor, I am going to have Daniel and maybe Kevin when he gets back go watch her house until Zac comes back from Antier." Adam didn't give her any chance to argue with his plans. Turning her around, he guided her like a lost child to his big truck. "Come on, sweetheart, let me take you home." It was probably a good thing he was taking charge, she thought, looking down at her hands. They were shaking too badly to do much of anything. Pulling the car onto the main road, Adam looked over at her and she could feel his eyes on her profile as she stared ahead. "What did he say to you?" Sanaa just shook her head. She wasn't ready to talk about it. At first, Adam didn't say anything, seemingly taking her silence as an answer. Before finally he spoke. "It was about that day, wasn't it?" Horrified, she looked at the man. How could he know about that? Her mind reeled as the unwanted memories that plagued the edges of her mind came rushing in. Desperately she combed through them, whirling past the trauma and tangled flashes of scenes, trying her best to see how he could possibly know about that day. Glancing from the road, Adam gave her a sad, knowing smile. That told her he knew. But how? It was impossible. No one knew what happened that night, no one except her. Finding her voice, Sanaa looked away from him, grateful to see her house approaching in the distance as they drove down the narrow lane past Zach's house. I don't want to talk about it, please. I'm sorry. You don't need to apologize, Adam said solemnly, and she could see his wide shoulders slope a little as he exhaled heavily. Hell, it feels like I should be the one apologizing. Sanaa didn't understand the meaning of his words, but frankly she didn't care. They had pulled to a stop in front of her house, and all she wanted to do was go inside and shut the door to all of this. As I said before, I will have one of the boys come watch the house for you. Just in case, Adam told her as he got out of the car. Walking around the front of the car, he walked with her up the porch and held out a silent hand for her keys. Unlocking the door, he stepped inside and stopped, standing perfectly still. Adam scanned the front hall and living room. It felt as if his eyes were seeing through the walls and the ceiling, examining every inch of the house. Satisfied, he turned to her and handed her back her keys and gave her a gentle smile. Would you like Sandra to come up here, or maybe Lana too? Come dash. No please, she held up a hand. I'm fine really. Thank you for everything. Nodding, Adam turned and walked out the door and down to his truck. She watched him as he gave one last look at her house before climbing into the large pickup truck and turning it around in the drive. Watching the truck disappear into the distance, Sanaa let out a shaky breath. A breath that seemed to have been holding her together like cheap glue. Looking down, she stared at her shaking hands before clenching them together in a fist. She needed to sit down to think things through in a quiet space and allow the assault of memories that were now at her mind's inner sanctum banging down her door. Looking up the stairs, she thought of the big clawfoot tub in her master bathroom. She could take a soak and bring the world's largest glass of wine with her. No, that was no good. Looking at her watch, she winced at the time. In an hour or maybe less, depending on when Darius or Adam called him, Zach would come back from Antier Falls like a bat out of hell, more like a hound of hell, she corrected with a wry smile that did not reach her eyes. No, she could not face Zach just yet. She needed time to herself, time to gather the ghosts from the past that threatened to break her. Turning slowly on her heel, her eyes scanned the serene living room unseeingly as she tried to think, and then she stopped, settling her gaze out of one of the large windows. She saw the forest beyond and remembered how Zach used to meet her at the forest's edge just beyond sight, pulling her into his strong arms before taking her to the quarry. That's where she would go. Opening the door cautiously, Sanaa peered around the front of her house and saw no one. There was no Wati's bodyguard assigned as of yet. Trading out her thin raincoat with a thicker sheepskin coat she had hanging off the hook, Sanaa pocketed her phone and keys and dashed down the porch steps and across the large lawn. The path to the quarry was wider than she remembered, and Sanaa was grateful for that. She imagined random Tarki citizens, or most likely animals, walking the path continuously and widening it over the years. She couldn't help but wonder if her wolf had used this path. Distracted to the details of the forest, unlike her usual self, Sanaa found herself at the rocky structure far faster than she ever had in the past. Shafts of bright early morning sun speared the stone and water, illuminating them both brilliantly. Around her, birds chirped happily in the trees as a breeze swept through and shook at their branches. Standing below the large, flat rock that backed the quarry, Sanaa was surprised to find it not as intimidating of a formation as she did when she was younger. Back then, the rocky edifice seemed towering and daunting when Zach would climb it and invariably pull her up along with him. Now it seemed quite easy as she grabbed a few spots and heaved herself up onto the flat rock. Looking down into the icy greenish-blue waters below, the smile of success faded from her lips as the ghosts of the past tore down her last defense, pushing her unwillingly back to the past. 7 years ago. Running down the sidewalk of downtown Tarki, Sanaa ignored the puzzled looks of people she passed. She knew what she must have looked like to them, with tears streaming down her face. Could they see the heartbreak and the betrayal gleaming back in her watery eyes? Could anyone see the pain of her heart being ripped apart reflected in her face? She doubted it. They would just see the quiet daughter of Fatima and Rajesh Bhatt crying on the side of the street, struggling to breathe, needing to get away from any possible prying eyes. Before someone phoned her parents, Sana slipped into a narrow alley between two buildings. With her back to the street, she wiped at her face even as her face scrunched up again at the pain. How could she have been so stupid? Beautiful, confident, and obviously far more in touch with her sexual side. That girl was far more suited for someone like Zac. Together the two of them just looked a better match than Sana could ever dream of standing next to. Zac, how could he have said all of those beautiful things to her that night? If he didn't truly mean them, how could he have looked her in the eye with such earnestness and lied like that? The knot in her stomach turned painfully, and Sana leaned her shoulder against the cement wall. It hurt more than she could bear to stand. She had told him she loved him, and like a fool she didn't realize until this moment he never said it back. She wanted to throw up, to scream, to yell, to do anything but stand here and hurt like this. Wiping her face again, she blinked a few times as she heard the screeching sound of a metal door closing somewhere ahead of her. Walking into the opening of the alley, a figure stopped and stared at her. Sana, the male voice called out. Sana frowned and squinted at the figure. The light from the sun was coming in behind the figure, making it hard to see the details, but she vaguely recognized the voice. Slowly the person walked forward into the alley with her. What are you doing back here? He asked, and she could see now that he got closer it was Todd Wilson from the pharmacy's photo counter. Todd gave her a worried look as he searched her face. Are you okay? What's wrong? Wiping at her cheeks once more, Sana could just imagine what she looked like, with her tangled hair from running, swollen red eyes, and tear-stained cheeks. She couldn't get herself to lie and say the word fine. Seeming to understand, the taller boy ran a hand through his nearly blonde hair and looked around uneasily before turning back to her with a wide-eyed look. Since you have your camera with you, do you want to maybe go take some pictures? There is an abandoned farm near the north side of town with a grain silo and everything, and not too far from there is an old cemetery that I think is abandoned too. Sana hedged, looking for a polite way out. Holding up both hands, Todd gave her a sympathetic smile. No pressure it was. Just an offer. You just look like you need a distraction, that's all. He explained. He was right. She desperately needed something to take her mind off Zac, and the ache it caused in her chest. Straightening from the wall, she pushed her hands through her long hair, doing her best to smooth down the dark brown tresses, and nodded at him. You're right, I do. I'll go. From there they walked to the north end of town, stopping along the way to take photos of the afternoon sun hitting various objects. Chatting comfortably about school and photography, Sana learned a lot from the boy as they made their way past the last of downtown and residential areas to the more rural portion of town. When she mentioned she had never seen him the summers she visited prior at his mention of living in Tarkey since he was 5, Todd laughed. That's no surprise, he admitted. I'm going to let you in on a bit of a secret. I used to be quite fat and covered in acne. He gave her a conspiratorial look as he waited for her response. Looking at him, Sana gave him a skeptical frown as her eyes passed over him. Tall, though not as tall as Zac, she thought with a pang to her heart. Todd was lean and had a good-looking face. If she really stared and examined his face, she could see a few indentations and light scarring to his skin where she assumed his acne must have gotten bad, but for the most part she found it very hard to believe his claims. Seeing her skepticism, Todd's smile grew wider, and he looked away with a flush to his pale cheeks. I promise you I was just as surprised by the very late influx of hormones as you were. But I swear towards the end of the summer last year I just seemed to grow. I had been working outside in my uncle's backyard helping him install a new water feature. He's nuts for Japanese gardens and has a whole zen backyard filled with ponds and big stone shrines, by the way, and I guess between puberty finally coming in and the hard work under the sun my acne just went away and I was at least 3 feet taller. Wow, I bet that made going to school that year quite interesting, Sana said, as she stepped over a broken fence rail. Up ahead they could see the old silo and what looked to be a still-standing farmhouse. Oh yeah, it did, he grinned. The sheepish look he had moments ago vanished under his shining glee as he remembered the apparently fond times of that year. I'm not going to lie, I loved every moment of it. Sanaa laughed. I just bet you did. Sounds like the plot of a bunch of those movies in the 80s, where the unpopular kid becomes popular. Todd stopped in the overgrown field they were trudging through and gave her a wide-eyed look of amazement. That's exactly what I thought too. Smiling, Sanaa resumed walking until they eventually reached the barn. It wasn't until walking around the structure when they could see that it was in a precarious and dangerous condition. Half collapsed on one side, the once red barn, judging by tiny sections of red paint they could still see here and there, was rotted and badly leaning onto one side. I'm surprised the old girl is still standing, Todd whistled under his breath. It looks as if one strong wind could just topple the thing over any second. Holding up her camera to her eye, Sanaa circled the structure, stepping closer to take a few shots as the light glided over its sloping roof. It's kind of beautiful this way though, right? She marveled, still with her camera pressed to her face. The sudden light grip at her elbow startled her, and she pulled back her camera to look at Todd's gentle smile as he gently pulled her back a few steps. Don't get too close to it. Town is a good ways away and the signal is terrible out here. If something were to happen to you, it would no doubt end terribly. Not to mention imagining your parents' reactions. Sanaa nodded. You're right. Circling the old farm a few times, they took pictures of everything they could find, which was surprisingly plenty. It wasn't hard to imagine the farm back in its prime, reassembling itself like a movie rewinding on the screen. Sanaa could picture the overgrown fields trimmed and neat as a tractor slowly plodded its way down the large expanse in slow lines. The metal silo would gleam in the light, shiny and new and not rusted and pocked with holes as it was now. The various old tools wouldn't be broken and strewn across the ground, covered in years of dirt and rust. They would be whole again and hanging in their proper place in the red barn as animals chuffed and nickered in their stalls. It was a beautiful place once, and yet oddly beautiful now, even as she stood on the broken cement floor to what no doubt was once the foundation for the house. Clicking through her images on the LCD screen, she looked up to Todd as he came towards her. He was squinting from the bright afternoon sun and had a look of surprise on his face. I think I just saw a wolf. Really? Where? She asked, looking around to the tree line of the forest that surrounded the farmland. What color was it? Brown. I thought it was a dog at first, he explained as he clicked through his own images on his camera. I was trying to get a photo of it, but as soon as I saw it, it scurried off back that way, he said, pointing back in the direction of town. Oh wow, too bad you weren't able to get a photo. Last summer I saw a black wolf, but it ran off before I could do anything. Not that she had even considered taking a photo of it, she thought with a smirk. She had been so scared all she wanted to do was run. Oh yeah. Todd gave her an interested look, obviously intrigued by the subject. My dad says there are quite a few wolves in this part of Oregon. Nodding his head at her surprised look, he continued. He even says that there is special law between the three towns, Tarkey, Galding and Antier Falls, that no one is allowed to hunt or kill any of the wolves. It's punishable by prison time. He said that years ago someone did shoot one, like in the 50s or something, and that guy spent the rest of his life in prison because of it. Sanaa's eyes widened as she pictured a faceless man spending the rest of his life in prison for killing a wolf. Seemed harsh and unlikely, but maybe it was an odd federal law, and they just wanted to make an example out of the man. Checking his watch, Todd looked up at the sun and back to her. Did you still want to check out the old cemetery while we still have good light? She considered taking a look at her own watch. It was getting kind of late. She didn't realize how much time they had spent out here. Or we can go back. Todd gestured back towards town, his face open and friendly. I don't want you to get in trouble or anything. Just thinking of going back made the pain in her chest return full force. She didn't want to go back, not yet. She didn't want to see Zac, and she didn't want to go home and pretend like nothing was wrong. She just wanted to stay pleasantly distracted just like this. No, she shook her head. I want to stay. Show me this infamous cemetery. Well, I don't know about infamous, and I may have oversold it a bit, he laughed, rubbing the back of his head with one hand as they walked towards the forest. It's kind of small actually, but an interesting subject to shoot. But if we want to go, we should probably go now, he said, his voice suddenly tinged with a note of hesitation as he looked worriedly toward the forest ahead of them. Seeing her questioning expression, Todd sighed. Well, the last time I was there, which was a few days ago, I met a couple of guys, brothers I think, who have a van parked out there. They're obviously camping out there by the looks of it. They're about our age, maybe older, and they just seem kind of rough around the edges. But I know they work at the fishery by the docks till sundown, at least that's what they had mentioned. So they are like the quintessential hooligans from the ongoing 80s movie Which Is Your Life? She asked with a suppressed laugh. Todd turned and gave her a wry smile that made his already pleasant face look even more handsome. She could see girls at his school giving him loads of attention. Har har, he said mockingly. I'm just saying we should go now before they come back. I rather not have to make small talk with them. Sounds good to me. She gave him an exaggerated salute that made him laugh. How long had she been out today? Looking at her watch, she frowned at the time. It was only a few hours till dinner time. Looking up at the sky, Sanaa noted its dying light as the sun made its way ever westward. She should just turn back now if she wanted to avoid getting yelled at by her mother. But as she followed Todd into the tree line of the forest and finally out of the overgrown field, she knew what that would mean. Going home meant facing reality once more. It meant letting her bruised and bleeding heart focus back on the terrible pain that Zac caused. She wasn't ready for that, not just yet. Besides, she told herself firmly, it was approaching the golden hour. That wonderful time of day where the setting sun created beautiful soft light on everything, making any photo come out brilliant. She was tired of being safe and cautious and ever obedient. Look where it got her. Just this once, she would break the rules and come home when she was ready after she got the shots she wanted. Whoa! Todd held out an arm that stopped her in her tracks and pointed with his other hand. Looking around his shoulder, she followed the line of his arm and the point of his finger to the trees ahead of them. Her eyes went wide at the sight of a tall, skinny brown wolf standing a few yards ahead of them, looking back at them. His dark yellow eyes gleamed in the low, shaded light of the forest. Neither her nor Todd made a move as they stared at the beast. Narrowing its eyes, the wolf looked at them for a few seconds before taking off further into the forest. Damn it, Todd cursed under his breath. I forgot to take a picture again. Sanaa laughed, her eyes still scanning the woods for the gangly wolf. Reminded her of the black wolf she saw last year. A little bigger and not as thin as he or she had been, but still young and lanky looking. She wondered if the black one was still somewhere in these woods. Now we know that we would both make terrible National Geographic photographers, she quipped. Laughing, they stomped through the high underbrush of the forest, stopping here and there to take pictures of the evening's golden light spearing through the leaves at various spots. Illuminated fungi rings stair-stepping up a tree, dripping sticky sap oozing down bark, or a toad sitting perfectly still. As they crouched near its rock to get their shots, finding another animal path, they both sighed at the easier terrain and followed its path deeper. There it is, Todd called out, pointing ahead to a small clearing. Branching off from their path, they stopped at the edge of the circular clearing and peered out at the square headstones. I wonder how old they are? Sanaa wasn't sure why she whispered the words. Maybe it was the same reason neither one of them stepped forward onto the graveyard, sticking to its edges as they both circled the perimeter. Somehow, it felt wrong to trample on the quiet earth, as if laughing and talking loud would somehow disturb the respectful silence that existed in this place. Who knows? But I will tell you, it gives me Pet Cemetery vibes, Todd said, with an exaggerated shudder. Sanaa smiled and nodded. It really does. Crouching near a headstone, she rotated her lens as she looked through the viewfinder. Delicate little white flowers bloomed in a cluster at the corner of one stone. Focusing on the subject, Sanaa smiled behind the camera as she watched the background blur and the fragile little bloom sharpen. Her shutter clicked just as she heard the intruding voice. Hey pharmacy boy, who did you bring us? Sanaa's heart stuttered, and she stood up abruptly as two older boys stepped out from the shadows of the trees. Next to her, Todd stiffened, wearing a matching pair of green overall waders that looked badly stained. The two boys had an almost pinched quality to their narrow faces that seemed to match their wiry thin frames. Yeah, long time no see, the other boy on the right said to Todd, but his eyes remained fixed on her. Gaunt, dirty, and wearing leering expressions, Sanaa felt herself taken. Instinctive step back from the two boys. There was something wrong about them. something that screamed at her intuition to turn around and walk away now. This is my friend Sanaa, Todd said, clearing his throat while his hand reached for hers in a strong grip. We were just coming to take pictures of the cemetery. The boy on the left, who looked older, gave them an oily smile. Oh well. That's cool, he said before turning the full brunt of his scrutinizing stare towards her. Hi Sanaa, I'm Lance and this is my brother Connor, he gestured to the slightly shorter boy to his left. You're pretty, Connor blurted out, his eyes raking her form up and down in a way that made her want to visibly shudder in disgust. Are you another one of those redskin Indians, or are you the towel-headed kind? Both brothers laughed as they stared at her with an almost cruel eagerness for her to answer. Sanaa stiffened, and she felt Todd's hand tighten around hers as he shifted uncomfortably in place. Watching her, Lance gave her a contrived smile of pity. I'm sorry, he cooed insincerely. Don't get your feelings hurt. We were just teasing. We didn't mean nothing by it. Finally, Todd spoke up and Sanaa nearly sagged in relief. I think we should go. Pulling her as he turned to leave, Todd made to step around the two guys just as Lance shifted to the side, blocking their way. Holding up a hand to Todd's chest, Lance gave him a cold, slimy smile. Hey, now no need to get your panties in a bunch, pharmacy boy. We said we were just playing, he said, giving Todd a savage look before turning to her with a sly smile she assumed was supposed to be flirtatious. I'm sorry. We've been roughing it across the country in our van too long, apparently. Let's start over. Come have some beers with us. We've got off early and wanna just relax. With friends. More like we got laid off, Connor grumbled under his breath. Shaking her head, Sanaa stepped back. This close to them, she could smell the overpowering fishy odor clinging to their clothes. No, I need to head back. It's getting late, she announced. Turning on her heel, she could only hope Todd was going to follow her as she began making her way back to the trail they took. Either way, she was leaving, with or without him. She heard the crunch of leaves behind her and breathed out a sigh of relief at Todd's voice close behind. Yeah guys, I'll catch you both later, Todd called out, though she could hear the lie in his words. Her parents are strict, and I told them I would get her home before dark. Her heart was pounding as Todd came up beside her, giving her a glance filled with just as much tense worry as hers as they both picked up their pace. Through the now gloomy underbrush, Sanaa could hear the brothers saying something to one another, but she couldn't make out what they were saying as both she and Todd tried to subtly put as much distance between them and themselves. They continued to walk, the seconds ticking by uninterrupted, turning into a minute. Above them, the sky was streaks of orange and yellow as the sun fell behind the trees and the mountains in the distance, leaving the forest half-lit and pocked in shadows and sporadic shafts of light. Looking at Todd, Sanaa could see some of the lines of worry around his eyes fade, and he gave her a tentative smile as they walked in focused silence. Lance's voice to her right broke the tentative spell of relief. I think they're trying to run from us, Connor, his voice called out in a clear, unmistakable taunt. Both she and Todd stopped, sharing a brief panicked look. Fuck, that's rude. Don't be rude, pharmacy boy, Connors called from somewhere to their left. How about you share your little friend with us and we'll be sure to get her home safe and sound later tonight. White-hot fear surrounded Sanaa's heart, making it feel suspended in her chest, separated from her vital organs as she looked at Todd in horror. The meaning of their words fractured through her thoughts with images so terrible it made her blood run cold. Fear danced in Todd's eyes for the briefest second before he reached for her hand. Painfully, his grip around her hand tightened as he pulled her into a full run. Get them! Lance shouted from behind them, his voice so much closer than she expected. Inside her head, Sanaa felt as if she was screaming as she picked up her feet and pushed her legs to take her faster away from here. Sounds of the leaves and brush being disturbed to her left and right pricked at her ears and sent another infusion of icy hot fear to her heart as the thumping running footsteps of the brothers closed in on them. A figure shot out from a thick cluster of trees, tackling Todd to the ground. It was Connor. Nearly tripping over their grappling bodies, Sanaa stumbled into a tree as she watched Connor pin Todd to the ground, punching him in the face. Stop! She screamed, taking a few steps forward, intending to shove the boy off of him. But the painful grip on her shoulder pulled her backward. Sanaa didn't need to turn and see the other boy trying to pull her backward. Twisting her body in a panic, she wrenched out from his grip just as Todd kicked Connor off of him. Todd's wild, scared eyes searched until he found hers as he scrambled to his feet. "Run, Sanaa!" he yelled. Not waiting and not looking back, Sanaa ran in the opposite direction. She had no clue which direction she was running, no idea if she was going deeper into the shadowy forest or back towards the town. She just ran. A howl sang through the air somewhere nearby as footsteps pounded into the ground behind her. "Come back here!" Lance yelled. There was an unmistakable glee and anger coating his words that made her tired legs move faster. Her camera beat at her chest as she frantically picked up her speed. Why was this happening? Why did she come out here? They were going to catch her and hurt her. Her mind faltered with painful static as it conjured up horrible scenes of assault. A scream split the air. What the fuck? Lance's advancing footfall stopped, and Sanaa only prayed he was turning back to investigate. Refusing to stop running, she ignored the sneaking tendril of worry in her mind for Todd. She could help him best by going to get help. She couldn't fight off two guys by herself in an attempt to help him. Another scream tore through the quiet forest air. Turning to look over her shoulder, hoping to catch a glimpse of Todd, Sanaa's foot caught on something hard. For the briefest second as she felt herself hurtle forward, Sanaa heard the unmistakable sound of an animal growl just before her body slammed into the ground. The growling sounds grew louder around her, matched only by the screams. Was that Todd or was that Connor? Sanaa didn't know. Blinking, she tried to focus her head hurt and she felt sick. Pushing against the soft earth to lift herself up, Sanaa let out a painful sound as her vision swam and her stomach turned at the movement. Falling back down with a thump, Sanaa breathed in and out, desperately trying to gather her strength to push herself up onto her feet again. She couldn't lay here. She had to run. A crack sounded overhead, stilling her heart in her chest. But it was the blood-curdling scream that followed that made her body feel like lead and her eyes go wide. The scream stopped, cut off from its completion. Frozen in place, Sanaa fought back a wave of nausea and blinked back the blurring darkness at the edges of her vision as she strained to listen. Another howl sounded, closer this time. Was it the wolf? Did it come back with its pack to hunt them in the forest? Had that been Todd's scream? Or was it one of the brothers? She prayed it wasn't poor Todd. Oh God, would the wolves come for her next? Hot tears spilled over the rim of her eyes, but she ignored them as she forced herself up onto her knees. Sanaa bit back a groan as her camera fell away from the sore spot near her ribs where she had fell on top of it. The camera was surely broke, if not her ribs, she thought as she swallowed the urge to vomit. She couldn't bring any attention to herself. She had to get out of here. Clawing at the ground, soft cold dirt slid up and underneath her nails, caking itself into the half-moon crevices. Stumbling and unsteady, she crawled forward before pushing herself upright into a fumbling run and away from the growing growls in the distance. It no longer sounded like a wolf. The images of the gangly brown wolf from earlier and the skinny black wolf from last year were pushed out of her mind as she listened to these louder, more feral sounds. The low-toned reverberations sounded deep and from the chest. They sounded hungry and bestial. Tripping through the low-hanging branches, Sanaa winced as one swiped very near her eye with a searing slash. Reeling to the side, Sanaa covered the side of her burning face with one hand just as her sneakers slipped on a damp clump of leaves. Again, she wasn't quick enough to break her fall and she hit the ground hard. The force of landing on her side took the breath from her lungs. Laying there, it felt as if the two lobes of her brain were focused on two different things. One side forcing her to listen to the sounds of the twilight forest around her while the other tried unsuccessfully to fumble through her muddled thoughts. It was the thud to the ground around her that brought her thoughts back into focus and just above the hazy black fog that threatened to swamp her consciousness. The heavy reverberations of the movement made her want to think of a falling tree hitting the earth instead of focusing on the second thud. Followed closely behind. It felt like footsteps, her mind whispered in terror. Too afraid to move, Sanaa laid perfectly still on her side and listened to the deep rattling sound of breath behind her. Oh God! The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and her insides clenched as every primal instinct within her body told her there was something large and predatory behind her. Sliding Her hand from her wounded face, she placed it over her mouth. Sanaa pulled her knees up until she laid in a fetal position. Tears seeped into the seam of her fingers and slid down towards the ground as the thing growled deeply. Closing her eyes, Sanaa prayed, "Please God, don't let me die. Don't let me die. Don't let it hurt me." She repeated the prayer like a mantra as she waited within the darkness of her closed eyes. She thought of Todd and wondered where he ran to. Had that loud crack been a gunshot? Were those screams she had heard belong to those awful guys or poor Todd? She prayed it had not been Todd. She prayed it soon wouldn't be her. When she had opened her eyes again, she was staring up at the familiar random pattern of her bedroom ceiling. Blinking tiredly, she let the memories of the night come back to her. Todd's smile, the old abandoned farm, the sense of wrongness from those two boys' screams, gunshots, the hot puff of breath at her neck, and something long, black and curved shining in the low light of the dying sun. A claw? Her heart was pounding as the temporarily forgotten fear crept back inside her chest and settled around her heart like a chain of thorns. How did she get here? The first thing she could remember was standing at the bottom of her porch, leaning heavily on a familiar solid chest when her front door opened. Turning away from the wonderful warmth holding her, she saw images of her mother, father, and grandfather rushing down the stairs and hands grabbing for her. Sanaa could only partially listen as her mother demanded answers from the calm, steady voice as he sorrowfully told her they had been out taking pictures and had gotten scared by a bear and lost in the woods. He told them he had to go back and try to find their other friend, who was still lost in the woods, but he would be back in the morning to answer the rest of their questions. She was ushered into the bathroom and simultaneously berated, given the third degree, and fussed over by her mom and grandmother. But she could hardly answer their questions as her grandmother dabbed at the small cuts with alcohol, and her mother decreed she would never be allowed to leave the house again. Her thoughts were on him. How did Zac find her? That had been his strong arms holding her up and his deep voice talking to her parents outside. But when? And more importantly, how? Lying in bed, she stared up through the dark to the ceiling above and tried to think. She remembered the creature being over her as she laid on the ground. Zac had said it was a bear. Did he scare it off? Had he been out looking for her ever since she didn't show up to their meeting time? Why did he lie and say he was out with her and Todd? She had so many questions and so few answers. It only made her head hurt. Turning into her pillow, she inhaled the faint smell of him that still lingered on her pillow from the night before. The pain from seeing him with that girl still pulsed painfully in her heart, along with the constant thump of guilt at leaving Todd. Tomorrow she would wake up and find out the truth and find poor Todd. The sound of the doorbell ringing that next morning took her from her sleep, although it was the sound of voices in the foyer that got her up from the bed. Ignoring the fact she was still in her unicorn pajama pants and tank top, Sanaa opened her door and squinted at the bright light from the front door. "It would really help if I could talk to her, ma'am," Sheriff Salmon said tersely. "And as I just said, she is asleep," Fatima Bot replied, her voice as cold as ice as she stared at the sheriff through her open door. "She was lost in the woods last night and needs rest." "Yes, but there she is. Sanaa Bot," he called out to her, leaning past her mother to see her. However, he gave her no time to confirm his question. "I need you to answer a few questions about last night." "Now wait a minute," her father, who had been standing behind her mother, stepped forward towards the sheriff. "You have no right to come here demanding anything from anyone. We told you she was with this young man and another one named Todd or something. What else do you need?" Coming closer now, Sanaa stopped next to her parents, her eyes widening at the small group of people standing on the porch. Standing next to his uncle and sandwiched between a deputy stood Zac. His eyes found hers immediately. Betrayal and confusion collided within her heart as she noted the relief in his eyes as he looked her over. "Last night 2 young men camping in the woods went missing under suspicious circumstances," Sheriff Salmons explained impatiently. "We found blood and evidence of a violent crime. We need her to answer some questions." Appalled, her mother looked to her and to the sheriff, anger mutating her features. "My daughter had no involvement in anything like that. There was no mention of other men." She looked at her and Zac accusingly, wordlessly demanding that they confirm. "No, ma'am." Zac answered promptly, ignoring Salmon's accusing scowl. We just got spooked by a bear and got lost in the woods. I didn't see any others out there. Sana could see something pass through Zac's eyes, but she couldn't decipher. She couldn't understand why he was saying he was with her and Todd. Was he trying to protect her from her parents, including himself in her outing with Todd so she wouldn't get in trouble? Looking at her mother and father's face, Sana swallowed a knot of fear and shook her head as she looked to the sheriff's angry, waiting eyes. I don't know of any other guys. Todd and I and Zac, she added, seeing Zac stiffen at her near error. We're just taking pictures and heard the sound of something big, she said, her voice trailing off. Zac looked away from her, and to his uncle Adam, who looked to the deputy, standing on the other side of Zac holding something in his hand, gesturing for it. Zac took the handed item and turned back to her with it caked in mud. Zac handed her camera to her. I found your camera this morning, he said without looking at her. For a moment, she just stared at the broken camera before hesitantly taking it from his hands. Looking up sharply, she looked to the sheriff and then to Zac. Where's Todd? Did you find him? I brought him to the hospital last night, Zac answered her, and she could see a flash of anger pass quickly over his eyes before he averted them. I found him on the northwest side of the woods. Yeah, and the boy is catatonic and covered in someone else's blood. Sheriff? Salmon snapped, pointing an accusing finger at her and Zac, his scowl deepen. Now I know you two are lying and dash. That is enough, Sheriff. Having heard enough, Adam stepped closer, his heavy boots thudding with each step. Sana felt herself shiver at the sound. Last night something heavy had thudded. Just like that next to her, its breath so close she could feel it rustling the hair on the back of her neck. You have gotten your answers and proof my nephew was with them last night. Adam gestured to the camera in her hand. I'm sick and tired of your vendetta against my family, and I won't let you drag Sana into this either. We're done here. Laying his hand on Zac's shoulder, Adam gave her a soft look before speaking into his unmoving nephew's ear. Come, he ordered. Reluctantly, Zac stepped backward, never taking his eyes from hers as he backed down the stairs onto the graveled path. Sana could see everything unsaid in his golden eyes, anger, betrayal, and something cautious that almost felt like worry shining in their gilded depths. Feeling her father's hand on her shoulder, she allowed him to turn her back and away from the door, breaking her gaze with the boy who betrayed and saved her all in one day. Sana let out a painful sigh as she stared at the water below. That had been the last summer she had seen Zac, the last day she had seen him, actually. The next morning her parents had packed up the car and hustled her and her brother into it, driving back to Seattle a full 2 weeks earlier than planned. After that, summers at her grandparents' house dwindled down to just quick visits once she entered college, and Kamal started various basketball summer camps. It was as if that awful day had been some sort of turning point, or mile marker on the invisible timeline of her life. Unfolding her stiff legs from beneath her, Sana looked around the quiet forest. Over the years she learned to push away those frightening memories of that night for her own sake. Trying to recall details of that night only seemed to invite her imagination to play havoc with her. Images of wild bears had somehow evolved into visions of giant bipedal beasts with wolfish features. Recurring dreams of its long black claws scoring her skin and its sharp teeth mauling her flesh had forced her to bury that day deep inside of her. But now the memories were unearthed, and Sana could feel the guilt and the dread return. During a phone call, not long after her parents had scuttled them away that summer, Sana's grandfather had assured her Todd was released from the hospital and was doing fine, having suffered a bit of memory loss. From that night, he had supposedly asked about her to her grandmother once, when she was in town. Even now she felt the weight of guilt when she remembered the sunny blonde's gentle smile and herself not turning back to find him herself that night. Had Todd tripped and felt like she did? Her doctor back in Seattle had said she was lucky to only have suffered a minor concussion from her fall. She wondered if Todd suffered the same, if not worse. Something crunched behind, and Sana whirled around in her seat and let out a breath at the sight of Zac standing there. With his feet braced apart, his chest rose and fell in heavy breaths as if he had just run through the woods. Sana's skin prickled into gooseflesh as she watched his nostrils flare and his chest expand as he dragged in a deep breath. How did you find me? she spoke, hoping to dispel the mounting silence between them. Stepping forward, Zack reached for the rock as he lifted one boot to its craggy surface. Easily, as if walking upstairs, he lifted himself onto the flat rock and knelt by her. I can always find you, Sana. The real question here is, why are you out here and not at home? She could hear the spike of anger in his tone. I just needed some time to think. Out here in the woods. He gestured to the quiet forest around them. Right. After you got accosted by that fucking fat prick Salmons? He bit out. I just wanted some time to think, and besides, I'm fine. Why are you yelling at me? She demanded. Because when I get to your house and saw that it was empty, it scared the fuck out of me, he said, blowing out an exhausted breath as he sat down fully on the stone next to her. Reaching out, Zack took her hand in his and covered it with his other. Bringing it up to his mouth, he kissed the tips of her fingers sticking out and gave her a desperate look. Do you even know what my first thought was? Sana's heart clenched at the pain in his voice. Leaning into him until their hands were pressed against both of their chests, she kissed the underside of his taut jaw. I'm sorry, she whispered. I just knew you would come home, angry and wanting answers, and I just needed a moment. Zack pulled back enough to give her a searching look, his dark brows furrowing at her words. A moment from me? Frankly, yes, she admitted. You can be very intense, and I didn't need you. And she wanted to say memories of that night competing in her head for tension. And what? He pressed. The light pressure on her chin made her want to sigh as he tilted her chin up. His brilliant eyes gleamed with worry. Swallowing, Sana dropped her gaze to their joined hands and sucked in a painful breath. Salmons asked me about that night. He told me that they never found those two boys' bodies. He made it seem you had something to do with it. That we both did. Silence was her only response. Looking up, Sana frowned at the mixture of emotions in Zack's face. Anger was what she expected, but there was something almost like hesitancy written on his face. Seconds dragged by between them, like eternal minutes, and she realized he wasn't going to say anything. Desperate now, Sana leaned forward and tightened her hands over his. That night when you found me, Todd and I had run away from two guys that had been camping in the woods, she explained. I think they had meant to hurt me. Her voice broke at the painful influx of memories, but she continued on. And maybe hurt Todd to get to me. They. Sure. He hushed her as he stood up to his feet, pulling her up along with him. Brushing some of her hair from her face, he tucked it gently behind her ear as his other hand pressed her hips nearly flush with him. Come on, let's go home and we'll talk about it there. Standing this close, Sana only needed to inhale to fill her lungs with the fresh scent of him. Nodding, she let him guide her back through the forest and back to her house. Hugging her body close to his, Zack waved at Kevin, who stood outside of his car on his phone. At the sight of them, Kevin's taut face fell into a look of relief before waving back with a nod and getting into his car. Guilt needled at her heart as she turned to look at Kevin's retreating car down the drive. I didn't mean to make anyone worry. Opening the door, Zack ushered her inside and closed the door. Don't worry about it. He was probably just freaking out for a moment when he didn't see either of us here. But he'll tell Adam and the rest that you're fine. Don't worry. Sitting down on the couch, Sana closed her eyes at the exhausted feeling that seeped through her limbs suddenly. Turning at the sound of the creaking floorboard, she smiled at the sight of Zack. Having taken off his shoes at the door, he now carried 2 wine glasses in one hand and a bottle of dark wine she had sitting in her refrigerator. Silently she watched as he uncorked the wine and poured them each a glass, the dark plum red liquid splashing into the glasses. Sitting back onto the couch with her, Zack handed her a glass and watched her as she took a sip. She met his gaze over the rim of her glass, setting it back down on the coffee table. She waited until he did the same before leaning forward until her cheek was pressed against his chest, wrapping her arms around his waist. Zack let out a rumbling appreciative groan that rumbled like thunder against her ear as he wrapped his arms around her. The silence between them felt charged with a type of healing she could not explain. With each minute that passed, Sana felt her body sink further and further into his, and the fear she had felt since Salmon's accusations faded away. After a while she found her voice again. How did you know to find me that day? It was a question she had always wondered about. Question she never got the chance to ask. His chest rose as he took a fortifying breath. When you didn't show up at our meeting time, I went looking for you. I found a couple of cousins who saw you. And Todd walk up north past the edge of town with your cameras. Figured you were heading to the old farm and followed. By the time I got there, you were gone. I knew you hadn't backtracked, so I knew that meant you both could have only gone in so many directions, and I remembered the old cemetery. When I got close, his voice hardened as he recalled that day. I heard those guys shouting at you both. I heard them laughing and chasing you both. Lifting up from his chest, Sanaa gave him an eager look. Did you see them? Did you hear the screams and the gunshots? Yeah, I heard them, he said grimly, not looking at her. Sanaa frowned, not understanding the grave look in his eyes. Then what happened? What were they shooting at? Was it really a bear? And how did you get past them to get to me? She thought she would feel relief to know someone else could corroborate the sound she heard, but Zach's answers only made her questions come to life. Standing up from the couch, Zach ran both hands through his hair as he began to pace in front of her. The warm feeling of assurance faded as she watched the muscle in his jaw tick, and the glint of desperate anger in his eyes. Turning to her, he stopped suddenly and knelt to the floor in front of her. Tell me you love me, Sanaa, he commanded, his voice harsh and desperate. Tell me you won't leave me again, that you won't run away from me for what I am about to tell you. Taking her hands in his, he held on to her as if she would just get up and run away any second. I need you in my life, Sanaa. You're meant for me just as I am meant for you. Nervously she pulled one hand from his tight grip and cupped the side of his face. Her heart pulsed with pain as she watched him close his eyes and lean into her touch. I love you, she confessed, needing to ease his doubts. I always have. Even when I tried not to, she admitted with a reluctant smile. Zach let out a deep, almost animalistic grunt of relief before leaning forward and pressing his lips to hers. Sanaa sighed at the sudden contact and was opening her mouth to his just as he pulled away. Startled, she watched him as he stood up to his full height and walked away. Stopping at the large picture window, Zach lifted one bracing hand to the molding as a cloud of darkness swept over his face. Silently Sanaa waited, knowing he would speak soon. I didn't get past those guys, Sanaa, he said quietly. Sanaa shook her head. I don't understand. That night I didn't get past those guys to get to you. I went through them, he said tightly. I heard what they said about you, he said, turning to look back at her. I knew what they intended to do to you. I had to. Sweetheart. A year or so after that day, my uncle had found out those guys had been up and down the West Coast kidnapping and assaulting women in their van, leaving one girl in California dead. And before you ask, he paused, his eyes turning into steel. I have no regrets for what I did to. Chapter 12. Sanaa covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes filling with tears as the meaning of his words sunk in. Oh God, I'm so sorry, Zach. Never, not once. Since then did she imagine this. She always thought he had just found her. That night, not that. Tears obscured her vision and she tried to blink them away, but as she caught sight of his drawn face and tight features, she imagined the pain he had to endure to do what he did. A pain he had to live with all these years alone because of her. I didn't know, she whispered, lifting her hands to him. She wanted to hold him, to wrap him in her arms. Anything to take that hard look from his face. As if letting go of a held breath, Zach walked into her arms and fell to his knees in front of her. Feeling him face bury his head in her chest, Sanaa wrapped her arms around him and held him tight. I know, he groaned from between her breasts. When I found you, you were barely conscious. She could feel his grip around her waist tighten as he growled the words against her. I was out of my mind with anger. I wasn't myself that night. It took all of my control to gather myself before picking you up and carrying you back to your place. I didn't think it would help you. Or me if I told you what happened to those two assholes. The gunshots, she exclaimed, pushing him back by the shoulders so she could see his face. Cupping the sides of his face, she looked at him in horror. Did they really try to shoot at you? Zach averted his gaze but didn't let go of her. Yeah, he admitted, reluctantly. But why? Her fingers sunk into his shirt, covering his shoulders. Her imagination ran wild with images of him getting shot and falling to the forest. floor all alone in the night, caused her physical pain to even think it. There were screams and, I just don't understand why they would immediately shoot at you. His wide shoulders moved up in a shrug beneath her hands. Maybe they could see from my expression that I had every intention of murdering them. Who knows? It's old news, sweetheart. They were garbage and not worth the worry, he assured her in a deep velvety tone, smoothing back her hair from her face. He stood up, pulling her to stand in front of him. Sanaa hesitated. She was still so confused. And Todd, she urged, you found him and brought him to the hospital. Yeah, I found your friend. She could hear the undercurrent of a snarl in his tone. Pretty sure I scared the shit out of him and I would feel bad about it if the idiot hadn't taken you into the woods where he knew those scumbags were making camp. Poor Todd, she murmured, not hearing his grunting noise in response. Guilt knotted her stomach as she thought of both Todd and Zac out there that night. She had been nearly out of her mind with fear that night. She couldn't imagine what they had felt, all on account of her. Turning her face back up, some of the knots of guilt loosened within her as she met Zac's searching gaze. Lifting her hands, she pulled herself tight to his chest and listened to his thumping heart. Oh, Zac, I'm so sorry you had to do that. Despite his arms coming around her, pressing her to him, Sanaa could feel him stiffen as he replied. It was just the first of many. Leaning back just enough, she gave him a reluctant look. What do you mean? I went to a very specialized branch in the military, he explained. Those two certainly weren't the last to die by my hands. His words settled heavily over her, and she nodded, nuzzling her face against his hard abdomen. She felt him inhale her scent and hold her closer as her thoughts raced at the implication of his words. Her heart hurt for him. She wanted to hold him close and apologize for hours, though she knew he would just tell her it wasn't her fault. But it was. No matter what he said, it was her fault that they had all got caught up in that horrible nightmare that night. Straightening in his arms, Sanaa looked up at him, taking in his beautiful, strong features. She loved everything about him, the strong line of his nose, the rise of his strong cheekbones, and his smooth bronze skin. Lifting her hand, she traced the pale scar over his eye, loving even that about him. Zac turned his head into her hand until his lips met her palm in a soft kiss. This is just one of the many amongst the others, he said in a hushed tone. Tugging him gently by his silken hair, she smiled softly as he obeyed the silent command and bent down until his face was level with hers. Tracing the scar once more, she placed a kiss gently against it. Show me, she whispered boldly. Sanaa felt the muscles in Zac's firm shoulders and arms bunch and harden against her as he brought his arms down to her waist and lifted her up in one fluid motion. Wrapping her arms tight around his neck, Sanaa closed the remaining distance between them and covered his mouth with hers as he slowly took her upstairs. I called your cousin Ezekiel in Antier, and he hasn't seen any sight of salmons. Trying going up there in that direction, Adam said from his seat next to him. Today they were sitting on Adam's porch, occupying both of the white wicker patio furniture that decorated the spacious porch. Yeah, Darius, who was leaning back with his arms crossed on the railing in front of them, chimed in agreement. And Garrett in Galding says he hasn't seen any sight of him in town, but of course that doesn't mean he didn't pass through. He may have just left like we told him, and if so, good, Darius added roughly. The fat, racist bastard should have left years ago. Zac made a sound of agreement under his breath as he looked down at the yellow-painted floorboards of Adam's porch beneath his feet. He considered his uncle and cousin's words as he thought of the sheriff's empty house he visited yesterday. Zac had been on his way back from Antier when he got the call from his uncle about what had happened to Sanaa. His need to get back to Sanaa had not been as strong as it had been. Zac would have lost control. The world around him had already started to change into that familiar bluish dichromatic hue as his knuckles cracked in pain. With gritted teeth and ragged breath, he somehow maintained his sense of self and caged down the beast of anger within as he drove the rest of the way to Tarkey. Like a hound out of hell. Still, too on the edge of his control, Zac had stopped at Salmon's place. First, he vowed to himself he would fulfill a long-time dream and finally gut that fat bastard and leave his corpse for the wild animals to finish off. But the dream remained unattained. Salmon's house was empty. How is Sanaa doing? Adam's words brought his attention back to the present, and Zac looked up at his uncle before leaning back into the wicker porch chair with a wolfish smile. Shifting against the wood railing next to a planter box of Sandra's flowers, Darius laughed at Zac's expression. I take it you're happy as hell now? That you finally got your girl? Zac smiled even broader as he thought of last night. As soon as he laid her on the bed, there had been only a few seconds spared as they both removed their clothes. Zac had let out a sigh of pure pleasure as her wet, searing heat wrapped around him. Cradled in her arms and legs was where he always belonged. He meant to take it slow with her, to prolong the pleasure until it bordered on mindless torture. But through the dying sunlight filtering in through her window, Zac could see the dark outline of a bruise on her arm and knew that it was from Salmon's. Anger had pulsed through him, pushing his hips faster and faster. Sanaa's sensual cries spurred on the beast within him as he let his anger fuel his movements. Even through his violent thrusts, Sanaa held onto him tightly, rocking her body for more and more even as the first changes began to rack his body and stole his words, either ignoring or unaware of what she was doing to him. Sanaa arched her back and fed her glorious body to his as the deep guttural growls escaped his throat and filled the room. Completely absorbed in their love, she had wrapped her legs around his hips as he roared his release into the night air while his sharp nails sank into the mattress. After a while, his body spent, and the beast within sated, Zac had held his breath as he looked to Sanaa only to release the tension with a soft laugh. Like a contented kitten, she wore a soft satisfied smile across her lips as she sleepily nuzzled closer into the crook of his neck. Yeah, she's good, Zac finally answered, his smile fading, but it brought up a night she had been trying to forget. His uncle nodded solemnly and fixed his dark golden eyes on Zac. Did you tell her? Did I tell her I killed those two bastards in the forest that night? He ran an agitated hand through his hair and stood up to brace the wood railing next to Darius, looking out to the spacious yard. That's not what I meant, and you know it, Adam pressed. No, goddammit. I haven't told her. Zac heaved a sigh, not wanting to talk about this. Turning around, he faced the man that had become a second father to him. It's not that easy, and you know it, he bit out. You need to tell her, Zac, Darius said seriously, especially before she gets pregnant. The word acted like a brand to his flesh. Turning to Darius with a snarl of warning under his breath, Zac smiled a razor-sharp smile as the older man stood up straight from the railing and let out a threatening sound of his own. Dark gold eyes flashed dangerously as they stared back at Zac, and Zac could feel his own baser nature react to the man's unspoken challenge. His muscles tightened and bunched with the need for a fight. Enough, Adam's deep voice barked out. Standing up from his chair, he placed a hand on both of their chests and pushed them both back a few steps. Turning to Zac, Adam gave him a firm but understanding look. You can't put this off any longer. Snatching his gaze away from both of them, Zac paced to the other end of the porch and put his hands on the back of his head, and looked up to the sky. Everything he wanted was right here. For once it felt like his life was complete, but that could all vanish if he told her. Sanaa can handle it. I know her, and so do you. She is different, but you have to trust her, Adam said, knowing exactly what he was thinking. Yeah, well, it wasn't that fucking easy. Adam never had to tell the woman he loved he was a goddamn monster inside. He simply waited for his brother to die and swooped in and settled down with a woman who already knew their family's secret. That's what Zac wanted to say, but he kept the harsh words buried deep as he turned away from his uncle's waiting gaze. He wasn't really sure when it started between his mom and Adam, but when he came back to Tarky, the unspoken reality of their relationship was there, open and irrefutable. Yet, instead of being angry at the relationship, Zac just found himself a little bitter. How easy it was for Adam to find the woman he loved and settle down with her, unlike him. With just a few simple words, everything between him and Sanaa could come crashing down, and she could easily leave him again. Closing his hands into fists, Zac closed his eyes at the pain of his sharp nails digging into his palms. He wasn't sure if he was the type of man to let her walk away a second time. Twisting her lips to the side, Sanaa reread the text message from Zac. Going for our family's fall moon hunt. Be there by 10-ish. Be naked. When she first read the text, she blushed and laughed under her breath, but Now as she stared off into the darkness out her window, she frowned. Inside in her warm house and wearing a pair of thick cotton lounge pants and a matching long-sleeve shirt, she still shuddered at the thought of traipsing through the forest on a cold November night. But that was the Wattese clan for you, she thought with a sigh. Their traditions would be upheld, good or bad weather. Turning away from the window, she walked into the kitchen carrying her empty salad bowl and glass. Setting them in the sink, Sanaa grabbed the sponge and pumped a glob of blue soap on the bristled surface as her mind wandered. What other rituals and customs did the indigenous First Nation family do? She knew for a fact the Watteses didn't even acknowledge Thanksgiving, a holiday no one in Tarqui dared to bring up around them unless you were wanting a long, visceral speech about the violent colonization of North America. Purification, potlatch, and naming ceremonies were some of the few rituals she was familiar with, but a moon hunt was something completely new to her. She imagined Zac out there in the woods with other male Wattese members creeping through the dark underbrush of the forest. Boys fresh out of their Odapanaw ceremony, grueling rite of manhood the Wattese celebrated, would undoubtedly be trailing behind their chosen elder, learning and mimicking their actions. Cold dart and carrying weapons, it all sounded like a recipe for an accident to her. Setting the dishes on the drying rack, she resisted the urge to check the time. Again, this was crazy, she thought as she stomped into the living room and sat down on the sofa with a huff. Just how did the Wattese women deal with this? Every year. Just the thought of sending her child into the woods to hunt God knows what was unthinkable. Jabbing the power button on her remote, she settled into the couch and began scrolling through Netflix as she remembered what Zac told her. He had been a part of a special section of the military. Images of men with painted faces slipping in and out of the jungle and placid bodies of water at night came to mind. All scenes she had seen in various movies, but most likely based on facts. Was that the kind of thing Zac had done during his time in the military? Surely that would make him probably one of the best people to take out on this hunt. Although her hand paused on the remote, Zac had told her every male member of the Wattese family joined the military, so if that was the case, it was probably very safe with this particular group of men. Look at her, not even a week into their relationship she was already rationalizing and changing her views to align with his. In the past week her mind has drifted to children more than it had ever done in her life combined. Pulling her bottom lip between her teeth, Sanaa tried to stop the light feeling of happiness that crystallized inside of her. Maybe this was what people referred to when they talked about finding the right one. Was it just a natural thing for a woman to think of expanding their life and family when they found someone that made them feel cherished and safe? Forgetting about the TV, Sanaa slowly twirled the remote on the arm of the couch as she let her thoughts drift like clouds of fluff at the thought of sinking into Zac's arms. Again that night, the light on her porch flicked on, and all thoughts of happiness flew from her mind as she froze. The motion-activated light would only go off if there was someone on her porch. Stiffly she checked her phone, not wanting to move. It was a minute after 10. Was it Zac? No, Zac moved very quickly. By the time the light came on, he normally had the front door unlocked and was already stepping into the vestibule. Panic made her heart stutter as she considered another option. Was it Salmon's? Did he come back to accost her again about that day? Shifting her weight slowly onto her feet, Sanaa silently stood up from the couch. She would run upstairs and call Zac, she told herself, making a mental game plan to barricade herself in her room. And if he didn't answer, she would call the sheriff. She was just taking her first step back when a shape bounded up right outside her picture window, setting its two front paws on the ledge. Sanaa let out a ragged sigh as she wilted back onto the couch. With her hand to her still thundering heart, she glared back at the black wolf, who cocked his head to the side in a cute wolfish what. Dropping back down from the ledge, the wolf paced to her front door. Sanaa walked over with a tired smile, watching the top of his ears glide past the base of her window. Opening the front door, she stepped into the vestibule and opened the outer door. The impatient wolf's big head slipped in first and nuzzled at her thighs as he slipped the rest of his long body through the door into the small space. "Oh, hey there," she cooed as she scratched behind his tall ears. "Long time no see, big guy. I thought you forgot about me." Sitting his backside on the floor, the wolf gave her a patient waiting look, his golden predatory eyes not at all scaring her like they should. Reaching down, she stroked her hands over the gentle soft curve of his head between his ears, letting her fingers bury into the deep fur of his midnight hackles. The wolf stretched its neck, tilting its long snout up and against her stomach as he closed its eyes to the sensation. Sanaa laughed softly. "You're getting so spoiled," she said, despite adding another scratching hand to his scruff. "But you can't stay long, you got that." The wolf opened his eyes but didn't move his head from resting against her as considering her question. From this position, with his ears slightly tilted back, he reminded Sanaa of just a normal dog. His golden eyes and big inky black pupils were huge and made him look like a sweet puppy instead of the ferocious beast he really was. Stepping back, she opened the door and let the big wolf slowly trail into the house with her. Long claws clicked and clacked in a slow, unhurried rhythm behind her as he followed her into the living room and sat patiently by the couch as she sat down. As soon as she sat, his head came to rest across her lap and she smiled. Returning to her assumed duty of petting, Sanaa marveled. Not for the first time at the size of the docile wolf. His head took up all of her lap. His glossy black coat shined in the low amber light of her living room lamp as he sat leaning against her, his eyes closed to the pleasure of her strokes. "I'm glad you weren't out there tonight," she whispered as she leaned back into the cushions of the couch. The wolf's warm head felt good against her. Better than any blanket. Not that any of the Watis would shoot a wolf, at least I don't think. I was worried you may come across one of the younger ones and scare them. The wolf shifted against her and sat back and regarded her with its molten gaze before hopping silently up onto the couch with her. For a moment her heart lurched as the beast stood well over her head, reminding her exactly what kind of scenario she put herself in with this wild animal. But the fear immediately vanished as he plopped down with a languid sigh and rested his head back onto her lap. Completely pinned now, Sanaa watched as its pink tongue shot from his mouth and licked at her hand. Once, twice, 3 times. "Don't get too comfy," she warned as she covered a yawn from her mouth. "You can only stay for a few more minutes until Zac gets home." The wolf didn't bother opening an eye as he nestled deeper into her lap as if to make a point. Turning against her sheets, Sanaa opened her eyes at the feel of hot skin next to her. Despite the low gray light of the bright fall moon streaming in through her windows, Sanaa could make out the sun-browned skin of Zac's naked torso. Sleepily, she blinked as she followed the slow, gentle curve of his stretched back and up to the strong rise of his shoulders where his arms caged the pillow beneath his head. With his face turned towards her, she observed his sleeping features, partially obscured by his silky black hair. Moving closer to him until his hot, smooth skin touched hers, Sanaa let out a sigh at the contact. Curling into him, she smiled against him as he shifted, and a heavy arm came down over her, draping over her breasts and securing her